Hey, listeners, I want to let you know about two opportunities with Gotham Writers Workshop. Gotham Writers Workshop has been very supportive to Memoir Nation. I'm happy to say that I've taken Gotham workshops in the past, and I just had a great experience. And of note, coming up in March, Gotham Writers Workshop is hosting, both on Zoom and in person in New York City, a conference that's really tailor-made for you, memoir writers and nonfiction writers alike. And the weekend will consist of panels on publishing and Q&A sessions and agent pitching roundtables in which you'll be able to present your writing directly to literary agents. And so to learn more about the Gotham Writers Nonfiction Conference, visit gothamwriters.com/conference. That's gothamwriters.com/conference. And to sweeten the deal, Gotham is offering you an affiliate code for a discount on their classes. So use code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them Brooke and Grant sent you.
Hello, testifiers, disclosers, and offers of truth. Welcome to another episode of Memoir Nation. And wow, what a whirlwind this new year has been, Grant. It will be still January by the time this episode airs, amazingly, but also sobering, honestly, because I feel like in some ways I've lived 3 months in the first half of this year already. You know, we are doing the January Story Challenge, and we're going to unpack that a little bit. But we also burst into the new year with various challenges and busyness, not to mention the chaos of our administration, the very upsetting events unfolding in Minneapolis. So, Grant, hi, hello.
Hello. Happy New Year again, Brooke. We can just keep saying that. Every day is a new year.
Well, as long as we're still in January, for sure. So let me start by asking you how January Story is going, and also happy recent publication day, because your January has also been about the fact that you have a new book out, Something Out There in the Distance. So again, congrats. It's super exciting.
Yeah, it is. And thanks so much, Brooke. It's been super interesting to launch a book while also writing a book and putting on January Story with you. The book I'm writing is my memoir. And so there are kind of three very different energies, you might say. Yeah, but the book has been, it's pure fun to me. And I'm one of those really rare writers who's just so needy of attention that I actually love promoting my book because it's a different type of creativity. And for this one, I made my first book trailer, which we're going to talk about a little later in this episode. And also, the book is a collaboration, so I'm not doing it alone. And it's just so fun to have a partner in this endeavor. But for my memoir, it's my undernourished, underwater, nearly abandoned memoir. But fortunately, it has been resuscitated by January Story. So everything's going as we planned for the event, at least for me personally.
Good.
Yeah, because my challenge this past year has strangely been making time to write the memoir. And actually, I realized part of that was because I don't think I fully have believed in the memoir. And I say that I let my work and what I call the business of life essentially evade my writing time. And that's because that's where I've found love and affirmation and the feeling of productivity and purpose. But in January Story, I pledged to carve out just 30 minutes a day to write. And I've really built a moat around that 30 minutes. And I've shown up nearly every morning to write. And so I've written, about 500 words a day, which is the goal of the event. And I feel momentum. I feel an invitation into the story now. But I know we've had similar challenges, Brooke. So how about you?
I mean, I relate to all of that. January Story has proven to me why it's hard to write my memoir. Let's put it that way. So the good news, the hugely good news, is that I'm doing it. I have missed a handful of days, but the fact of the challenge has really put my memoir front and center for me, as opposed to on the back burner where it's been living for the past 2 years. So I did keep my holiday commitment to print out my pages. And then that was like to print out and read them. And then I have been getting in there and, doing the work. A lot of these pieces are vignette-y, I will say. I think that's probably due to the 500-word challenge, because that's what I feel like I can do. But my mom got appendicitis over the holidays, and she was up here visiting me and then was in the hospital starting on December 31st for 4 nights. And then she came to recover at my house, and then I flew home and stayed with her for a couple of days. And that all ran like well into the first week of January. And it was just a reminder about living life on life's terms. I had a very different vision of how the first week of January was going to look, and something else got delivered. But even still through that, I did write. Those were a couple of the days that I missed, though. I showed up not quite with the dedicated attention I was originally hoping for. But you know what? It's all okay. I think that's the number one thing. Like, the experience has been awesome. I'm in awe of all of the writers who are doing it with us. That's the most exciting thing to me, in all honesty. Like, the dedication, the write-ins, the rallying around the effort to get the work done in our community has been really awesome and inspiring.
It really has been. And I was just talking with some writers about this kind of strange fact that writing with other writers on Zoom, it actually is motivating and inspiring. When I first heard about people doing this, I was like, it's so not for me. Mm-hmm. But there's something ineffable about how just being with other people, even online, you feel their energy and it enhances your creativity. And I like this saying that I came up with, that free zones of creativity tend to happen with others. And that's the case with me, definitely.
Love that so much. And speaking of free zones of creativity, I think we get that in spades on this show as well, and I'm super excited today because we have Andre Dubus III on with us today. And Andre is probably best known for his fiction, especially his novel, The House of Sand and Fog. But his memoir, Townie, is no slouch of a book, as it turns out. It came out in 2012. It won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. It was a finalist for the Indies Choice Book of the Year for Adult Nonfiction, included on best book lists from all over the place. What struck me most about it, Grant, was how he wrote about others. And that really is what stayed with me as I kept reading. And it got me thinking about how some memoirs are very plot-driven or story-driven. It's actually been a minute since we've mused over solipsistic narratives, which we both actually like. And if you want to nerd out on what that is, dear listeners, you can go back and listen to our archives. Like Rachel Cusk comes to mind, Amir McBride. But Dubus, he's the opposite of that. And so if solipsistic writing is about not having enough sufficient awareness of other people, Andre really does show us how to write with deep, deep awareness. And he does this as he talks about other people's impact on him as he comes of age in a truly violent environment. The adults are absent, distracted, or overwhelmed. The institutions that are supposed to protect children fail them repeatedly. And, I think that there's a lot in the book, Townie, that's hard to take in, actually, but that's also the point. And for me, it was actually impossible to read without thinking about all the ways in which Andre's depictions of violence, as learned and as a measure of masculinity, really give me insight into what we're watching unfold in our country right now. And so we're going to talk to Andre about this a bit in the interview, but Townie is really a book about violence, and violence is the organizing logic of the world that Andre grew up in. And a lot of us, myself included, were lucky, not to grow up in a world in which that is true. But now we see violence being modeled, celebrated, rewarded. It's very disturbing. And I've heard this said, Grant, that we're feeling this tearing, that what we're witnessing is tearing us apart, tearing the social fabric. And it's a good word. So I just wanted to look it up, actually, the etymology of it. And it comes from the Old English Tehran, which means to rend, rip, or pull apart by force. And so I just wanted to give that context because all of this was swirling in my mind when I was reading Townie. And so I guess you could say I couldn't quite separate the book from the events that we're watching unfold in modern America, and just people who revel in violence and force and tearing things apart. And, some of those people populate the pages of this book, but it was also a really kind of fascinating read because of that.
Definitely. I kept making that kind of association while reading the memoir. And it's just really interesting book and an agitating subject matter for sure. And in the interview, we're specifically going to ask Andre about his thoughts on making readers uncomfortable. He 100% does not narrate from a position of moral superiority, and he expresses that in a really interesting way, which means we have to wrestle with questions of responsibility and exposure and harm. And it sounds to me, Brooke, like it very much wrestling with these questions as you read the book, but you also applied them to a broader context. And of course, that's what we do when we read. And it's what we try to do as writers, to make our stories relevant enough that people overlay their own lived experience onto our stories. And it's interesting that by the end of the book, Andre does absorb the violence in a way into a larger moral awareness. He, the character that's coming of age through all of this hardscrabble experience, comes to understand that violence is learned and contextual and systemic, and that masculinity is constructed and enforced, and that harm is cyclical rather than anomalous. But then what he doesn't do is tell you what to do with these awarenesses or offer any ways to heal or to interrupt these cycles. It just simply is. So in that way, Townie is a book that offers up a lot of moral complexity with very little attempt on the part of Andre to interpret it. And I have to say, I appreciate this. It's perhaps an indictment on human nature and on our culture, but this book is a window into the lived experience of a lot of people in this country.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And another thing I thought of as I was reading it, it's another question we'll take with Andre in the interview as well, is writing about others, because there are always ethical and boundary concerns for writers when it comes to writing about other people. And when you and I saw Dani Shapiro last summer, she was doing a keynote at Understory, which is a conference that we were both invited to speak at. And during the Q&A, she talked about something that he'd said in another panel that they were at, that what happens on one side of the door belonged to his brother, and what happened on his side of the door belonged to him. I'm glad that he's going to expand upon that in the interview. But what I like is that it's a very good visual, because we are impacted by the things that happen to other people, honestly, especially inside our own homes sometimes. And in this case, Andre's brother is having a sexual relationship with his teacher. He's young at the time, like middle school and high school. The woman is much older. Andre in the interview calls it abuse. He does not posit it as that in the book, however. It's clear that there's a power imbalance, but I think because young Andre maybe didn't see it that way, but adult Andre with hindsight clearly does. And he talks about all these things. His sister was raped. Another sister locked herself away from the rest of the family. His brother tried to kill himself. And in his first draft, he did not tell a lot of these stories. But his editor said to him after reading it, this is a quote I saw in another interview with him. I get the feeling that a lot more went on in that house than you're letting on. And I have experienced that both as a reader and as an editor, feeling the distance of what you're not saying. And in another 2012 interview with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Andre said, the hardest part was writing about my family. I had a conversation with the novelist Richard Russo. Again, this is something Andre's going to talk about in the interview. We cover a lot of ground today. Andre said to Richard Russo, I told him I was tortured about writing about my family. And he said, look, if this were me, I'd ask myself, am I trying to hurt anybody with this book? Am I trying to skewer anybody? If the honest answer is no, I'm just trying to capture as honestly as I can what it was like for me, then I do it. It was such good advice. So what do you think of all of this, Grant? I think these questions of exposure and potential harm, they're always big ones for memoirists. Honestly, they can stop people from writing, and they are nuanced because harm doesn't mean that we're physically damaging someone. It can be as small as hurting someone's feelings or outing a secret that someone wants to keep hidden. And so how are you grappling with what's yours to tell?
Yeah, it's such a big question, isn't it? And when I first started to write my memoir, I guess I was just very naive because I didn't truly understand the depth of this question and the many layers in it, and then all of the possible consequences, which I just keep hearing stories from other people about this and what's happened to them, good things and bad things. I don't know if there's one answer to it, actually. I think every memoirist has to have conversations like the one Andre had with Richard Russo, which was just, it was fabulous advice. And I think you have to take that and think about what's fair and right. And then all of the other consequences around writing, about others. But, even though Andre has the right to write about what's on his side of the door, and I totally understand that metaphor and that reasoning, and I agree with it to a certain extent. but the people on that side of the door with him might not want to be written about, you know? So we don't live our lives to be written about in a memoir. And in fact, it recently occurred to me that I don't want to appear in anyone's memoir, even if it's flattering, you know? I just think it would feel so strange to me. And maybe that's where the question begins, is how would you feel if you were a character in another's memoir? And then what is the ethical way to handle writing about another? And maybe ethical isn't even the right word. You know, maybe it's more about how can you be generous in your portrayal of them, all the while serving your story and serving your reader and excavating that, you know, possible pain that's attached to them. I don't know. Maybe I should go back to fiction, Brooke. It's a lot easier. This is hard. And yet the things that are most challenging, you know, they hold the richest and most meaningful material. And there is something about confronting these very issues that's meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you're speaking the language of a true memoirist, Grant.
I graduated.
Yeah. Yes, you have. You've arrived, you know, in other words, right? Conflicted, challenged, grappling with all there is to unearth once you start down this path. And this is why I say that memoir, in my opinion, is the most challenging of all genres, because it requires so much of us. So hang in there. You know, we can and we will persevere, even if it is, you know, on the timeline the memoir wants to be on. But that's what we're doing over at Memoir Nation, folks. So if you're not already with us, come join us. I'm super eager to hear from Andrea Dubus after this short musical break.
Well, Brooke, since listeners can't see us, I rarely compliment you on your attire or your keen fashion sense, but today I'm going to make an exception. And I got to say, that is one stylish t-shirt you're wearing. Just for our listeners' sake, it says, I was there at word one, Memoir Nation. And we also have another shirt, and I'm going to buy this one for you as a gift. And it says, OM, Original Memoirist. And I'm buying it for you because you are an original memoirist in my book, because you not only helped educate me about the genre, but you co-founded Memoir Nation, of course, which I want to let listeners know they should join to take part in our writing challenge to write 500 words each day this month. And you can still join us. Please join us and join a whole community of encouraging writers.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. I want to just say I'll take the compliment. It is a pretty spiffy t-shirt after all. It's a t-shirt we made to honor all of those memoirists who have joined us to help launch Memoir Nation and who are doing Jan Your Story. And there are several variations, in fact. So I really like this one. I was here at word one because it's kind of a memento to celebrate our beginnings. And I'm going to post a photo of it so people can see it. We'll put it on our social media. And it's a collector's item, of course. I mean, it says 2025, so we've already, you know, launched and we're out there in the world. And then we have mugs and hoodies. We even have a hip pack. So there's going to be more merch to come. And we hope people will come check out our store, which you can access through our website.
Yeah, it's true. These items are likely to fetch hundreds of dollars in years to come on eBay. So buy them, preserve them, keep them in vintage condition.
Mintage condition.
Mintage condition. I like that. And I actually bought T-shirts for my whole family. And we don't do the family and matching pajamas photo for our Christmas card. So I'm thinking maybe we'll do the family of memoirists next year.
I love that. And I want to say before we end this little ad spot that the shirt is comfortable. Thank God. That was what I was waiting for. I was really nervous that it was going to be scratchy, but it is good cotton. Yay to the company that makes them. So listeners, buy a shirt, buy a mug, buy a hip pack, but more than that, keep writing. I can't tell you how galvanizing Jan Your Story has been this month. It has been an invitation to write to hundreds of writers. I have written, I have to confess, not every single day, but on the days that I haven't written, I have caught up the next day. So I have been watering my underwatered memoir. I'm seeing it grow, which feels like a relief after all of these months. So we encourage you to go to the Memoir Nation website, click on the Jan Your Story tab. It is definitely not too late to join. You could even join on January 30th and you could still write for 2 days and we'd be super happy to see you there.
Even the 31st.
Absolutely.
And remember, it's free because we want to open the doorway to everyone's story because your story matters. We'll see you at Memoir Nation.
Oh, and if you want to get a shirt, you can find that on the website too. Just go to store and see you there.
Good sales.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Andre Dubus III, who has authored 9 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, House of Sand and Fog, The Garden of Last Days, and his memoir, Townie. His most recent novel, Such Kindness, was published in June 2023, and a collection of personal essays, Ghost Dogs, in March 2024. He's also the editor of Reaching Inside, 50 acclaimed authors on 100 unforgettable stories. I'm just going to go with Andre from here on out.
Please.
On the intro here, Andre, but you've been a finalist for the National Book Award, Guggenheim Fellowship, National Magazine Award for Fiction. I mean, it does go on and on. It's very impressive. Your books have been published in over 25 languages, and you teach at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and today you're joining us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brooke. But I got to, for all my Lowell people, you got to know it's Lowell, Mass.
Oh, baby. Lowell.
Yeah.
I know. I was just saying I'm a SoCal girl and I don't have
it's
the...
Okay. Kerouac Country, Irish Mickey Ward, guys like that. Where, by the way, my name wasn't Andre Dubus, but Andre Dufus or Dubus.
Of course. Easy to go there when you're a kid, I can imagine. Well, one of the things that you're routinely praised for is characterization across the genres that you write in. And since this is a podcast about memoir and memoir writing, I wonder if you can talk about how you approached characterization in Townie, and was it different than how you did it in your novels? And specifically, we do have a lot of writers on the podcast who listen to us. And so I'm just curious if you have insight for, people who want to pay more attention to how they're rendering their characters on the page.
Oh my God, it's a great question. I believe I have 7 hours to answer. Is that correct?
About right. Masterclass.
Nothing is more important to me in fiction or creative nonfiction / memoir or personal essay in character. It is the only reason why I read literary fiction. And years ago, I had this kind of insomnia I still have, where I go to bed at 11 o'clock and I'm wide awake at 2 till 5. And so I'm watching PBS, and Mike Nichols, a great film director, is being interviewed. And the interviewer asks him, "What's the question, Mr. Nichols, that the storyteller asks before writing story?" He said, "Well, it's not the question the newspaper reporter asks. That question is, what happened?" And, the other W's, when, where, who, not even why, that's analysis. But what Nichols said is, what we ask is not what happened, but what's it really like to be in this thing that's happened? And I think that is so damn helpful. It's simple, but it's not easy. What's it like? What's it really like? As in, what's it truly like to be in this thing that's happened? So to answer your question, as I found myself writing my own accidental memoir that rose from an essay, I had no intention of writing a memoir, I was free with having to come up with what happened. It already happened. Now I'm going back in my memory to try to recreate what it was like. Again, for me, I think too many memoirists fall into this trap of thinking that they're their family biographer. Well, no, you're not your family biographer. You are singing your song, and we all know how fallible it is and malleable, and how it conflates with other memories. And to me, the most poignant fuel, it seems to me, for writing a memoir should be the part of the writer that knows what happens, but still doesn't know what the hell happened, right? And I know Uncle Joe went to prison when we were 12, but what the F was that about? And so you embrace that Nichols question. What's it like? What's it really like to be in this thing that's happened? And so you empty yourself of trying to say anything with your memoir. You empty yourself of trying to make sense of anything, even in your memoir. You let go of trying to rectify wrongs or prove people right. I think it's essential that the writer of the memoir steps back into total unknowing. One of my favorite lines from Rumi, the 12th century Sufi poet, is "Sell your cleverness and purchase bewilderment." And let's look at the word to remember. We talk, in daily life, colloquial speech, we talk about, the opposite of remember is forget. I forgot where I put my keys. Oh, I remember where I put my keys. But you guys probably know the etymological opposite of remember is not forget. It's chop, 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 dismember. And so therefore the act of memory is reaching for the shards, reaching for the fragments. And it seems to me that the most honest approach then to creating character, which is the younger you is to let go of everything the adult thinks she knows about herself then, because we're wrong. And I would argue, too, that it's that younger, whether this is a 12-year-old boy or a 20-year-old young woman, that's the one we have to give the mic to. In order to do it, we have to let go of all of our agenda, all of what we think we're trying to say or paint, and let the kid take over again from the fragments.
Well, Andre, that is a masterclass in writing character. I wanted to listen for the next 6 hours and 45 minutes there.
Well, I have more to say, but thank you.
Well, there are a lot of themes in Townie and certainly a lot of interpersonal dynamics at play, but one of the themes is violence, and your story traces how a boy learns what it means to be a man when power is physical and fear is constant. And reading the book now, in a moment when violence feels increasingly visible in our national life, especially with ICE agents who are men, white men in Minneapolis right now. I'm curious what you think about the value and importance of writing about the ways in which violence gets learned and practiced and normalized and is often experienced as protection rather than pathology.
Well, that's a great question. I think it's essential. The violence in Townie, I'm glad you talked about fear. So much of what turned me from being a bullied little boy into a very dangerous young man, who, by the way, was never a bully. I went hunting bullies. I especially went after men who hit women and girls and kids. And I was on a very dangerous road that I still am so grateful and dumbfounded, spiritually dumbfounded, I survived at all. But what got me off the path of violence was creative writing and reading, was stepping into the lives of other human beings. And of course, the contract between the reader and the writer is, what's it like to be you? And so that you cannot write fiction, or I think read fiction, without having one's powers of empathy enlarged. And it's very hard to look at people in black and white terms. It's very hard. It's bumper sticker Christianity. I'm not a Christian, but it becomes easier to hate the sin and not the sinner. Back to violence and toxic masculinity. I love the word masculine. I think it's a beautiful word. And I think that too often we in our conversation about it, we throw the modifier toxic on it when it's not. I'm sitting in this house that I got to build with my younger brother, who I lost this year. We built this with our bare hands. It was a deeply masculine experience, but also deeply nurturing. I was building in a home for my children and my mother and my wife's elderly parents and my wife and me. I think that so much of violence originates, this is not an original thought, of course, but it does come from fear. It comes from fear of all sorts, fear of how I'm perceived. And that's a huge thing. It's still so with us. If a man is emasculated, he has to respond with force. You'll notice that son of a bitch who murdered Renee Good, who might be a perfectly nice guy when he's not in that uniform, but the first thing he does after he shoots her 3 times in the face is calls her a fucking bitch. That is a man who's covering for his weakness. That's a man who's instantly trying to rationalize the ugliness he did and then got absolute immunity from you-know-who. And so I could talk about this for days. I visit prisons. I visit halfway houses, county jails. I particularly like meeting with boys who grew up with guns and boys who grew up thinking if you're not prepared to hurt a man who's putting you in your place, you're not a man. So much of this is deeply narcissistic, rooted in a sense of self that has never been nurtured, that has never been given the water and light and love with a capital L to blossom into something that is larger than reaction. When I look back at my own writing life, you guys, whether it's what I wrote about in Townie with my own violent Milltown youth in the 70s, or the fiction that keeps coming out of me, is I keep writing, and I try not to think about theme when I write, and I tell my writing students, please do not think about theme, let the themes come organically. But I do see thematically that I have all my life been haunted about the difference between reacting and responding. After 9/11, George W. Bush reacted. He did not respond. And we invaded Iraq for a total waste of many lives, primarily, Iraqi, and of course, all the American troops. On and on, the carnage, the waste. it went on and went on. Violence is our worst trait. And I know it intimately. I mean, I used to knock guys out. I still, because I was a small kid, I'm 66 years old. I'm in as good a shape as I was at 25 because I still work out 6-7 days a week. I think there's that little boy inside me still waiting for the bad guys to come, and I have to be prepared. Now, I have not been in a fight in years, and I hope to never be in one again. But I do understand that the impulse to fight is one of great spiritual weakness, but also a very understandable one when you raise boys with a very narrow definition of what it is to be a human being.
Thank you for that, Andre. It's just so top of mind right now, and really interesting insights from your personal experience and lived experience. And I guess I want to go to the body, because in memoir, of course, writers have to inhabit their own bodies, but in a given scene, you are the age that you were then, right? You're 10, you're 14, you're 22. And sometimes I think it's hard to remember how you felt or to put yourself back in that moment. And in fiction, of course, you can just make that up. And so I'm curious what your advice would be for people who struggle to remember or struggle with accuracy, and what were some of the things that you did?
Well, I'll give you some tools that I find very helpful. My memory's pretty good with quotes, people's names. But if I see a movie tonight, you guys, it'll be a new movie come June, right? I'll forget I saw it. But so then I told someone that. I said, well, how can you write a memoir when you're going back 40 years? I said, well, if you're writing with authentic curiosity about your own life, right? If you're allowing yourself to actually be in a state of openness and bewilderment about what happened, if you let go of the fact that you think you actually know what happened, and then I'm so glad you mentioned that, Brooke. We write with the body, we live in the body. One of my favorite lines from writing is from Ron Carlson, wonderful fiction writer, who said in one of his essays, details are for the writer only. They're the instruments by which we steer. Now, we know the first part of that line is hyperbole. We know that details will ultimately give the reader a feast. But we first have to give the writer a feast. So they are the instruments by which we steer. So there's a moment in my memoir, Tony, where I sat down to write that day. I write 5 days a week and take 2 days off, and that's how it's been for 42 years. And all I remembered, again, remember, the fragment was my brother Jeb and I sitting on the stoop of this rented house my mother could not afford, even though it was in the ghetto of this mill town. The windows were painted shut. We couldn't even open them. It was full of fleas and gnats. The stoop smelled like dried urine from the drunks who would stumble up from the barroom into the street and take a piss on our stoop. Twice they even opened the door of our unlocked house and pissed in the foyer. So that's all I had to work with was the smell of dried piss, but that triggered the smell too. There was also that sweet smell, which the older writer knew was the flaking paint of lead paint on the clapboards. And when I recorded those two smells with my pencil and my notebook, there came an image. And the memory was on one of those days sitting on those piss-smelling steps with my brother, Cody Perkins, whose real name is something else, and 2 or 3 guys saw us and started to chase us. This guy went on to become a prize fighter, died at 25 of a heroin overdose. He stole our bikes. He and his boys are really tough. They're probably 13 and 110 pounds, but they were big and tough for us at 10 and 11, wherever we were. So we run away from them down the street, across, past the biker hog bar place, into the lumber yard, past a forklift, up over plywood stack, over the chain link fence, into a weed lot, under a wharf, and where we hid for 2 hours. And my brother was picking broken glass up out of the mud, and I was looking out the river, and the Coast Guard was pulling a drowned man out of the river and into the boat. When I sat down to write that day, I had no memory of that drowned man ever. That was buried in my psyche. But the combination of authentic curiosity, don't assume you know, don't try to say anything, just try to find it. That combined with allowing the details to steer, right? Allowing the smells, the light, the sound, the weather to come in, it steers, it opens panels of memory, which opens other panels of memory and other panels of memory. And it's remarkable. And you'll notice I've read it's just like that in therapy. Therapists do the same thing. So where was your father sitting? On the couch. Was he still in his raincoat? Yeah. And that's when you smelled the blood? Yeah. They're doing the same thing, this reaching for the sharp, pull back and make the whole. It's really, and look, even if, in my experience, even when I was uncovering difficult material, painful memories, it was pleasurable artistically, because I felt that it wasn't bullshit, that I was uncovering something real. There's a lovely phrase from a psychoanalyst out of London called, his name is Dr. Bolus, and he's got this phrase, the unthought known. Isn't that gorgeous?
Danny Shapiro mentioned that when we interviewed her.
That's right. Well, that's where I learned it from. Danny's an old friend. And we talk about the unthought known, and then there's Grace Paley's great, we write what we don't know, we know. And this from some ancient Chinese anonymous poet, we poets knock upon the silence for an answering music. But I want to say something to that too, because now I've taught a lot of memoir classes and workshops, and I come across an understandable challenge with a lot of the writers with whom I work, and that is they want to say something. Say, no, you got to understand. You got to hear about my story. I grew up. My father's an alcoholic. My mother's a sex worker. Here's how this is what it's all about. And look how I've turned out. And it's always, no matter how talented the writing, there's something flat and forced and still. And it's because I say it time and time again, and it's simple, but it's not easy. They are not curious enough about going back. You got too much of an agenda. It can lead to a one-note treatment of something quite mysterious and complicated.
Andre, it's like we worked together before this interview for you to kind of tee up my question here. So because I want to talk about writing about others, because you often report events without assigning language that would kind of settle their meaning or assign judgment. For instance, you write about your brother's intimate relationship with his teacher without pausing to define or explain or adjudicate. And I'm curious, is this an ethical or a craft decision or both?
Grant, I am so grateful for that question. I have never been asked that question. Next question, please. No, I'm kidding. It's a big question. I think it's both. But I lean more towards the ethical part of it. Especially when it came to my dear brother's experience being sexually abused by a grown woman in our house for 6 years under my mother's nose. She knew about it. It was a real double standard. If it were a grown man and a young girl, it wouldn't have happened. So part of that was, for me, well, that's my brother's business. That's his story to tell. It's not my story to tell. But my story intersects with his. By the way, let me back up, and I'll finish that question because it's a great one, Grant, for which I'm grateful. When I finished the first draft of this accidental memoir, I sent it to my editor, and she said, well, all this street fighting and violence is very interesting, but didn't you live with people? Well, your family, you've left your family out of it. I said, well, I don't want to violate their privacy. But isn't that part of your story too? I said, yeah, but excuse me. And that night I happened to be at a dinner party, and Richard Russo is an old friend, and he and I were having our wine, and I told him what she said. And he gave me the most helpful advice, and I want to share it with the people who listen to your show and you, because it's so helpful. I said, I know she's right, but I don't know where the line is. And what wasn't I writing about? I wasn't writing about my sister being gang raped by men who were never caught. I wasn't writing about her selling drugs. I wasn't writing about my younger sister so depressed she put a padlock on her door and her heart. I wasn't writing about my brother's suicide attempts or sex abuse, on and on. And I wasn't writing about my father's profound absence or my mother's depression. And this is what Rick said. He said, well, if it were me, I'd ask myself one question. Am I trying to hurt anybody with this book? Am I trying to settle any scores? He said, if the answer is yes, I wouldn't write it, or I write it, but I wouldn't publish it. If the answer is no, I'd go ahead and write it. You guys, as soon as he said that, the anvil fell off my shoulders. I was around 50 when I started writing that, and I was no longer angry at my parents. I had been earlier in my life, but I was no longer angry at their parents. I wasn't trying to settle any scores. I was just trying to capture what it was like to be this kid in this fatherless home, in this mill town in the 70s, Vietnam limping to a finish, Watergate, drugs, sex too young, violence, on and on. So then I knew I could do it. But then I was going to bring in the family more. But then the strategy became, okay, I'm only going to write about my family's experience when it intersects with my own. So when I found out my sister had been raped, and this is in the memoir, I called my father, and it was the writing of that moment that brought me back to the truth, which was, I want to stick it in his face. Yeah, your daughter, my sister, got raped in Boston because she hangs out with a drug dealer, skanky drug dealer, who took her to Boston for drugs at 3 a.m. But I didn't know that until I wrote it. And so I think we have to be loyal to the truth, the subjective truth. But whose truth? The truth of the young person you're going back and giving the mic to. In that case, in that book, Tony, it was young me. My brother would have written a different book. In fact, he read it when it came out and he said, well, you wrote the G-rated version of our lives. But back to the ethics. I love this line from Hemingway it's a famously quoted line from a letter to his editor, Maxwell Perkins at Scribner's. But, he said, Max, the job of the writer is not to judge, but to seek to understand. And I found time and time again, especially with my fiction struggles, that if I have a moral stance on a character's behavior or even thoughts, he or she or they are going to walk away like anyone else you judge at a cocktail party. They're going to say, well, screw you, off I go. So I try very hard not to judge any character under my pencil, even if, I have a novel called Gone So Long and the main character killed his wife. I have such hatred towards male violence against women. I mean, those are the guys I used to hunt. And a character like that tugs on my sleeve to write his story. It was very difficult to suspend judgment, but I had to get into the private skin of that character. Let me say about that. I believe whether you're writing memoir or fiction, we're talking about memoir here. I think we have a sacred duty to these sacred beings called characters calling us back to the page. There's a reason why you're being called back to that time and that place, and you must follow. And it's terrifying. One of my favorite lines about fear, I think it's Henry David Thoreau. It could be some wise old woman in the Nepalese mountains, but if the mad dog comes at you, whistle for him.
I love it, Andre. I'm impressed by your capacity to pull all these quotes. They're wonderful. I want to take it back to a second to Danny Shapiro because Grant and I were in Park City last summer and Danny was speaking, and you actually came up during one of the Q&As, like someone had asked her a question about ethics, and she said that you said on a different panel something about like what's on his side of the door, and I think it was referring to your brother in that relationship, is his story, and what's on my side of the door is my story. And that, of course, feels a little bit simplistic, and you did just unpack the ethics of it. But, when you're talking about something like your brother's relationship or your sister being raped, and I know that I deal with memoirists all the time who are like, that's not mine to tell, or can I do this? So, I mean, if you're brother or your sister had read it and said, you can't put that in, what would you have done?
Well, it's interesting you said that. And let me just go deeper because Danny has told me she quotes me having said that. And I was referring to a moment, and I think it's in Townie, where I'm 14 years old, he's 13. I'm walking by his bedroom door in this rented house our mother could not afford. And I can hear the moaning of sex, a grown woman moaning sexually. And I remember hearing that and feeling relieved, thinking, okay, well, if he's having all that great sex, he's not going to kill himself. And I was relieved because he had already tried to kill himself at 13. And that's what I said. So, the other side of the door is his story to tell, but the moans in the hallway is part of my story. And I'm going to tell it. I think it's very important that anyone going into the writing of memoir go into it with a sense of honesty, but fairness. But I also think it's hazardous to ask for too much permission. There's a big caveat to that. As long as your intent is rooted in compassion, love, and a desire to go deeper into your subjective truth, knowing that your truth may not be anyone else's in the family's truth. I did approach my sister and ask her. No, I didn't. No, what I did was I wrote it after that great advice from Rousseau. I wrote a much more honest, fuller depiction of what my family life was like then from my point of view. And then I told them all about it and said, here, read it and tell me what you think. But I was determined not to cut anything. I don't know if I'm being honest here. I think I was, God, I don't know. Let me tell you, first of all, my younger sister, Nicole, said, our childhood sucked. I'll read your fiction. I'm not reading the memoir. I said, okay. My older sister, Suzanne, came over, and she talks very openly about her rape. She's a national leader in domestic violence homicide prevention, by the way, and very proud of her work. And we had like a 6-hour coffee conversation, and she agreed with everything. The emotional tones of what I wrote, she also agreed with. It was fascinating. My brother, I was really worried about because I'm writing about his suicidal behavior and being victimized sexually by by an adult. I called him. We weren't able to meet, so I finally called him, and I told him, I said, listen, man, I got this memoir coming out. It's long. It's like 500 pages. There are probably like 3 pages to deal with your, abuse and suicidal stuff, and I just want you to know about it. And he's quiet. And then I said, oh, Jesus is going to come beat the shit out of me. He's going to sue me. He's going to stop the book. I said, Andre, I would never step on any painter, any artist's tube of paint. But can you put somewhere in the afterword that I'm not a fuck up and I'm doing great and I've got a business? I got kids to take care of. I said, yeah, man, I love you. I'll put it in the book, of course. But I don't know. I know a lot of people who've gone to their family and said, are you okay if I put this? One part of me says, okay, that's fine. If my sister was not comfortable sharing that she'd been raped at 19, I think I would have honored it and not put it in, but I would still have had to find a way. I would have made it general. I would have made it vague. My sister was, something really bad happened, and it increased my murderous rage for years that I couldn't help my sister on that night. It's a tough one. I guess my essential thought about asking permission is, if you, the writer, are going into the writing of your memoir, into the fragments and shards of your own memory, with the intent to be as nakedly honest and brave as you can, rooted and suffused with love, I think you just got to write the truth. I think you do. I was really worried about my mother. I left out in that first draft how she kind of checked out emotionally. She was really like a fifth sibling in the house. And I got this, after she read it, I got a letter from her in the mail. And I said, oh, I'm fucked now. A letter with a stamp, a letter, long, beautiful letter, thanking me for the memoir, saying, by your having gone back to your past, the whole time I'm reading it, couldn't I have done this better? Why didn't I do that better? Did I really do this? Jesus, she said, it helped me see my own life, that I was as lost and depressed and isolated as you kids. And, blah, blah, blah. My point, not blah, 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 it was beautiful and I wept. But my point is, it's not about the writing. It's about the fact that the truth can save everybody. That one person in the family says, but Dad, you drink too much. I mean, that's the brave one who can actually create positive change in a family. So I think that writers have, our total allegiance should be to the truth. That said, I think the worst memoirs that I have read are the ones where it was clearly just a hatchet job out there to hurt the people they're writing about. And I'm sorry, I'd rather not read it. You go get therapy. I think there has to be an element of fairness as well as honesty.
It's like the truth with love, though.
Yeah, the truth with love. Just make sure you got love in there.
Yeah. That might even be the answer to my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I bet you're going to have a different angle on it. So in closing, Andre, you've spoken about your willingness to let readers be uncomfortable and extending to things like not defending your choices in terms of, what you choose to show or writing about, and not narrating from a position of moral superiority and allowing your reader to wrestle with questions of responsibility and exposure and harm. So given this, where do you think that memoirs do have to grapple with questions of responsibility or exposure and harm? And are there any good guideposts you can offer?
Well, this is a big one here. I teach writing to undergraduates at University of Massachusetts, and I don't believe in trigger warnings. I won't do them. It's the big rage right now. And why don't I do them? I try to create a classroom where every human being, every stripe of human being is invited. I don't care your gender, your ethnicity, your gender, all of it, sexual preference. I don't care if you voted for Trump. Even you're invited to my room. It's going to be a compassionate, respectful, generous, rigorous, safe place. And I'm going to give you short stories and poems to read that may go to dark areas. These are adults. I will not infantilize them by saying, oh, be careful, there might be some domestic disturbance. No, the job of the university is to trigger the hell out of these young people, to challenge them the way we were challenged in a safe, I would say even loving environment. I used to box. When we trained for a fight, you have big head guard, mouth guard, big fluffy gloves, and, so you don't get hurt in training. In the fight, no head guard and smaller fight gloves. The world is no head guard and smaller fight gloves. So I'm not going to infantilize my students for a world that doesn't care how they feel. I am going to toughen them up with truth. I'm going to do it lovingly, compassionately, in a safe, totally respectful environment. Now, why am I bringing that up? I think we live in a time where everyone is just a little too sensitive about what's going to happen to me if I read this or if I experience that. We're adults here. I'm not talking about children. I'm talking about people 18 and above. The world is tough. We have to be strong. We have to be loving. We have to be open, malleable creatures. We have to be able to step. I think the very least we can do is witness the suffering of others. When I'm, I won't, I have a lovely friend who just cannot handle any sort of adult material. I mean, I not just physical violence. I hate gratuitous physical violence in film. Anything that is upsetting. And I said, but my friend, don't you want to be alive? One of my friends went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And after his performance, his teacher came to him, this great Shakespearean actor, and he said, that was good, but it wasn't great. Well, what do you mean? He says, I don't know what to tell you. Just none of us are one note. We are all a symphony. And so I finally get my Irish up when I hear about, well, that depressed me, or that I didn't want to go where that took me. You have every right to put it down. You have every right not to read it. I think we're living in a bit of an infantilizing time where, and don't get me started, the reason I don't own an iPhone, the reason I've never sent a text, the reason I've never been on social media, I don't even know what it looks like, is as a teacher of young people, right around 2011 and 12, I noticed that their daily joy plummeted. It's not global warming, which is horrific enough. It's not mass shootings, which is horribly horrific enough. It's staring at these screens 6 to 11 hours a day and becoming incredibly toxically self-involved, distracted, and not in their bodies, not in their souls. What does art do? What does literary art do? What does a great memoir do? My favorite definition of literature comes from Tolstoy. Art transfers feeling from one heart to another. Art transfers feeling from one heart to another. We will never feel a goddamn thing if we're given niceties, if we're given euphemisms, if we're given too much care. Sometimes the reader's face must be pushed right into the mud. Now, I say that with love, because truth is the only, look, Keats said it best, truth is beauty and beauty is truth, and that is all you need know on earth. And so I think we're living in a weird time. One more thing while I'm on the subject. I've noticed that my students young and old. I work in conferences and I have my students are, 50 to 90. Everyone's a little bit more careful these days. Everyone's a little bit more careful, sometimes a lot more careful. And it saddens me. And my own theory, you guys, is that so many of us, not me, because I've forsworn it all because I hate what it's done to the world. But I think even on a semi-conscious, unconscious level, we're worried about comments, follows, likes, and we sure as hell don't want to get canceled. And so no one is writing with, I mean, I'm generalizing. Some people are writing quite bravely. There's not enough bravery on the page. There's not enough risk on the page. There's not enough nakedness on the page. I do believe, and forgive the violent imagery of it, but I believe that every writer should write every day as if the next day you're going to get executed. So you may as well write the fucking truth. I think if we're not going to do that, go bake bread, which might be better for your loved ones. So I have strong feelings about one more thing.
Go for it.
Nadine Gordimer's got this great novel called A Sun Story, the great Nobel Prize winner, Nadine Gordimer from South Africa. And one woman is saying to another in this novel, or inside the woman's head, no, she's not saying it. She has an insight as to what sincerity is. She said, sincerity is never having an idea of oneself. Never having an idea of oneself. In other words, we are living our day without one eye on the mirror. We are living our day fully, wholly, in the moment, engaged with whoever is across from us, engaged with the tree, the bird, the old lady, engaged with the pencil, letting its sharp point take us into our psyche where astonishing truths lie that we would never know about without summoning the nerve and the courage and the faith to step into it. So when I talk like this, by the way, it is anti-publishing talk. Like, I teach a 14-week course. I do not allow my students to even say the word public or publisher or agent or career until the last 15 minutes of the 14th class in the 14th week in the third hour. Does this make sense?
Totally.
It does.
Yeah, because publishing is crushing people's spirits all over the place, Andre. So I love it.
Do you have time for an image from Jean Rhys?
Of course.
So Jean Rhys said, the great novelist from Britain who was also a sex worker. And she said, well, if culture is a great ocean, then there are major rivers that flow into that ocean, like Shakespeare, like Monet, like whoever she said, great artists. She said, but there is still small streams like my 5 novels, but they're still pouring into the same ocean. And I think that's such a gorgeous image that captures why we writers want to publish in the first place. Well, I liked yours. Here's mine. Well, I'd like to be part of the conversation. And I think everybody's invited, and it's a beautiful impulse. But to think about it too soon is not to descend into that beautiful, mysterious, exalting, terrifying place called the human imagination, which every kid gets at birth.
Right. And maybe also like publishing, I think, does create an environment where people are not encouraged to risk. So it's kind of what you're saying. It's like to let these students just have at it. So thank you, Andre.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andre. That was definitely learned a lot. I want to keep listening to you.
Well, I want to listen to you guys. Good luck on your work. Not good luck. My third grade educated pipe fitter grandfather used to say, man, the harder I work, the luckier I get.
That's the way.
May the muse be with you.
You too.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Brooke, I find that I always learn something new about publishing and promoting with each new book that comes out. And with my new book, Something Out There in the Distance, I did something I've never done before. I made a book trailer, and I got to say, it was so fun. And maybe the favorite thing I've ever done for a book, especially promotionally. I loved it because it was its own special act of creation. And I got to collaborate with my friends, Gail, who I did the book with, of course, but also Patrick Williams, the director of the film, and the renderers who provided the music. And honestly, I've watched it about 100 times and I haven't gotten sick of it at all.
That's awesome, Grant. Congratulations. I watched it. I loved it. It's very artistic and beautifully done. And I love the song. So everybody will have to go watch it, and we'll put it in the show notes. But what made you decide to do a trailer for this one?
Yeah, well, I'd always heard about other books doing trailers, but I hadn't thought about it a lot. But I have to say that this book lends itself to a trailer more than many books because it's a visual book to start with. I wrote stories to my friend Gail Butensky's road trippy photos, and then the stories all linked together into a longer story. And, Gail and I used to wait tables together in this very musically oriented cafe back in the early 90s in San Francisco. And Gail has been taking, she takes tons of photos of punk rock bands. She's been doing that since the early 80s. And so it was like the beauty of collaboration, because Gail asked a band that she knows, the Renderers, to let us use one of their songs. And then I asked my friend Patrick Williams, who is a filmmaker and musician, if he'd make a trailer. And the book is meant to be lyrical, so my text kind of floats through the video, in and out of it. And I like to think that it's almost like a music video as much as it is a book trailer. And I'm pleased because it now has more than 6,000 views on Facebook, way more than the book sales, actually. So maybe I'll go into the book trailer business instead. But on that note, it was funny, Brooke, because when I told, a non-writer friend about it, she said, books have trailers? And I had the same question when I first encountered a book trailer. And I imagine a lot of our listeners might have that reaction as well.
That's so funny. I think we should put your video on MTV. That'd be so cool.
Bring MTV back with it. I want music videos again in my life.
Oh my gosh, me too. Those were the days. But, book trailers became a thing in the mid 2000s. And I think that, of course, coincided with YouTube's rise that made video content so easy to share. And then publishers started looking for new ways to market books online. And the concept, of course, directly comes from movie trailers. And it's this idea that a short little atmospheric video like yours would generate buzz for a book. And I think that works. It's exactly what you've done. 6,000 views is great. You have to subtract the 100 that you've watched. So it's yeah. 5,900. But, initially publishers experimented with these trailers for just big releases, and they were looking for strong visuals or cinematic potential. But honestly, since I would say the last 10 years, they've become, first of all, more common, simpler. Self-published authors have started to create their own as well. There are all kinds of trailers. They tell stories. They're more artsy like yours. YA novels have also been the biggest adopter of book trailers because the audience is so online, so visually oriented. So there's just a lot to be said about this trend, but I think it's been going on for, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, and I know they've trailers are also quite popular in fantasy and science fiction as well, since those genres are kind of rich with world building visuals. And then now they're also big in romance because, of course, Book Talk and visual social media platforms have become major discovery tools. And on that note, I should say that short form video content on TikTok and Instagram Reels has partially replaced the book trailer format with more, kind of authentic creator driven content, which is, generally always preferable. And many authors now get more engagement from a 30-second book talk video than from a polished 2-minute trailer, which is basically the length of mine. But Brooke, I know that memoir and literary fiction have been slower adopters, although this is changing perhaps. So when literary books do have trailers, they are more like mine. I think they tend to be more atmospheric and kind of less plot focused.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the ones that we do, that my authors do for memoir and literary fiction, the memoirs in particular will often be kind of like a slideshow of photos telling a story. The literary fiction, or I should say commercial fiction ones, can kind of actually tell a story. Mm-hmm. So there's the author's voice sometimes will be narrated over their images. Sometimes people are hiring people to do full stories. I mean, it's really become quite an industry. And I think why this story matters now is always a great angle angle. If anybody is thinking about doing a trailer, make sure at the end not to forget to give all the details about how people can get your book, put your website, your name at the end of the trailer. Sometimes people get so up in the, work of doing the trailer that they forget to sell the book at the end. And so I'm oftentimes weighing in on stuff like that. But for memoir writers, I'd say that book trailers are an option, but not a necessity. But, like you're saying, if you're going to get a lot of traction and a lot of eyes on it, it can definitely and does translate into sales. And I will also say, authenticity is better than like slick production. And so they can be homegrown in a sense, especially for memoir.
Yeah, and we actually did some slick filmmaking to make it seem authentic, in the modern way. So we added this filter on our video to make it look like an old Super 8 film. But then, that plays into the aesthetic of the road trip, I think, and it was fun to do that, and the music. So yeah, and one thing I want to say also, just to add on one last thing, is it's one thing about it does make promotion more fun. It's also, I find that when I'm posting on social media about my books, that just posting the covers and the same images over and over again gets tiresome to me, and I'm sure tiresome to my Facebook friends. So it's something new and different to post. But I want to tell you, since I mentioned filters, we will not put any filters on the Memoir Nation podcast for you listeners. We don't need to, because we start and end with authenticity. So thanks so much for listening this week. We hope you'll join the Memoir Nation community and write with us all year, because your story matters and we want to help you tell it.
I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.